Welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining us here. This is our third week in our seminar on the science and politics of COVID vaccinations. Today, we are going to talk more about the coronavirus vaccines, both in the science and politics of what to expect. And we're going to have some good presentations by Andrew, Crystal, and myself. Before we get into it, I want to make a couple quick notes. First is that our previous sessions are now on YouTube. So if you missed previous weeks, check them out on YouTube. Andrew and Crystal will drop the links right here in the chat, or just message or email us and we will send you the links directly. Another thing is that we are skipping next Sunday. So we're going to create a little postponement to allow some scheduling issues on our end. And we will resume the week after on Sunday, February 7th. So we will not be meeting next Sunday, but we will meet the Sunday following. So today, to preview what we'll be talking about, Andrew will be talking a little more about the science of the adenovirus vaccines. Crystal will give more information on the One Health framework for treating public health holistically. Andrew will leave some notes on what to expect going forward into 2021 with the new vaccinations, including some updates on how the virus has evolved over time. And to conclude, I will leave some notes on how we can effectively talk with others about the vaccines and use some of the knowledge that we've been given in this seminar in these previous sessions. So with that, I will hand it off to Andrew, and you can have us start.
Awesome. Thank you, Dean. Can folks see my screen?
Yep, looks great.
Okay. Well, welcome to, like Dean said, the third week. And a lot of what I'm going to be covering today is focusing on the future. Where are we going from here? Now, vaccines will be an important part of that. And I'm going to start off by talking about adenovirus vaccines. And that's because the next vaccine, maybe the next two vaccines to be approved in the US are likely to be adenovirus vaccines. So there are two that are prominent right now. The first is the AstraZeneca/Oxford vaccine. And that was basically the first vaccine in the world to be used against COVID. It was deployed in early December in the UK. And since then, it's been approved in about a dozen other countries that include more than 1 billion people. So you may be wondering, why hasn't the AstraZeneca vaccine been approved yet in the US? And that's because it had a few oddities in its clinical trials. The phase 3 trials showed an efficacy of just about 60%, which is still pretty good, but definitely not what we saw with the mRNA vaccines. But there were some people in those AstraZeneca trials who got less vaccine, and they appeared to have better efficacy, which doesn't really make a lot of biological sense. So it turns out that it's actually quite difficult to get a vaccine approved in the US compared to the UK and these other countries. So AstraZeneca, instead of risking not getting approved in the US, which I think would really hurt their public image, has actually started another phase 3 trial based entirely in the US. And the results of that are likely not going to be available until sometime in April. And if those are positive, it may get approved, but it almost certainly won't be approved before then in the US. So Johnson & Johnson is the other company that is developing an adenovirus vaccine. And this is already in phase 3 trials. It's been there since December. And we would expect to see some early results in February. And this is interesting because it's basically the only prominent vaccine that is a single dose. And that's a big advantage over the other vaccines. It makes everything simpler in terms of delivering the vaccine. And so if those results from February are strong, then we could see this as a vaccine getting rolled out in the US as soon as March. And that's pretty promising. So if it works, that Johnson & Johnson vaccine is likely to be available sooner than the AstraZeneca vaccine, at least in the US. And so I wanted to go into how adenovirus vaccines work. And the New York Times had a really nice visualization If you find that what I cover is you're not able to follow, I would recommend you go to the New York Times and look for their coverage of the adenovirus vaccine. So I took a few images from there. And for folks who missed our first meeting, this here is a diagram of the COVID-19 virus. And it's covered, as you can see, by these red spike proteins. And they happen to be basically a perfect key for something called an ACE2 receptor. These ACE2 receptors are on the surface of most cells in our body, and they let the COVID-19 virus right in, and this is why the virus is so successful and easily spread. Now, inside the virus, it carries instructions for how to make that spike protein, as you can see here in red, and these instructions are called genes. To make an adenovirus vaccines, researchers copy this spike protein gene from the virus and put it as DNA into a type of virus called an adenovirus. Now, adenoviruses are pretty common viruses that infect humans. They typically cause colds. And to make the vaccine, they use a modified adenovirus that can enter cells but can't replicate inside them or cause illness. But this adenovirus vaccine does now carry the instructions for how to make a spike protein in red. If you're wondering more about adenovirus, decades of research have gone into adenoviruses, including work done by Johnson & Johnson to create a vaccine to prevent HIV. Obviously, that has not been successful so far, but that I think says more about how difficult it is to vaccinate against HIV than any issues with the adenovirus in particular. AstraZeneca, their adenovirus vaccine uses a chimpanzee adenovirus, which has been studied since about 2014. Now, one big benefit that we can see already is that the adenovirus vaccines have DNA, and that is just a much more rugged molecule than RNA, which is in the mRNA vaccines. And that means that these adenovirus vaccines, they can be stored in a fridge for up to 6 months and still be fine. And that's a big contrast with the mRNA vaccines, which really need to be frozen until they're ready to be used. And that's going to be really important for parts of the world that don't have access to reliable refrigeration, let alone freezers. Now, once the vaccine's injected into someone's arm, those adenoviruses make their way to a cell. They enter the cell, which viruses are good at doing, and they get to the nucleus, the cell nucleus. They push that spike protein DNA into the cell nucleus. And the cell then treats this DNA like its own DNA, and it starts making spike protein mRNA, and that comes out of the nucleus. The cell then starts creating spike protein from that mRNA, really the building blocks for the spike protein. And because there aren't any instructions to make the rest of the virus, like you would have with, for example, the COVID-19 virus or other viruses, these spike proteins just kind of diffuse throughout the cell. Some of them move to the cell surface. The cell also displays fragments of what it's making on the outside of its surface. And this it does using its MHC class 1 molecules. If you were with us for the first lecture, you'll remember that those MHC class 1 molecules, which are these little blue Y-shaped molecules on the cell surface, they're used by immune cells to help detect if a cell has been infected and turned into a virus factory. And because the cell is indeed making parts of a virus, to an immune cell, it's going to look like it's infected. And you may recall why this is so important, and that's because this means that these vaccinated cells will trigger killer T cells. And killer T cells are a really important part of a strong and long-lasting immune response. So that bodes well for the adenovirus vaccine. And the rest I'll go through sort of briefly because I went into this in more detail during the first week, which, like I said, is available on YouTube. So these spike proteins, they do end up getting ingested by antigen-presenting cells, such as this dendritic cell, and they help activate the helper T cells. These helper T cells then go on to activate B cells, and this is important because B cells can create these neutralizing antibodies. These are molecules that stick to the spike protein, and it basically coats the virus. so much that that virus just can no longer attach to new cells, and it's neutralized, hence neutralizing antibodies. And if you become infected by the actual virus after getting this vaccine, you'll have these memory B cells and memory killer T cells that are going to recognize that spike protein right away, and the virus likely won't stand a chance. Now, just to review sort of the key difference between the mRNA vaccine and the adenovirus vaccine, I want to show folks this diagram. Now, the adenovirus vaccine, as we just saw, it comes into the cell, it deposits DNA into the nucleus, and then that DNA, using the cell's own machinery, gets transcribed into mRNA, and that eventually creates spike proteins. Now, the mRNA vaccine, which is the Moderna vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, that skips a few steps. It just deposits that mRNA right into the cell, and that's then used to make spike proteins. So it'll be interesting to see whether the clinical trials of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine show good efficacy, as well as that second US-based trial of the AstraZeneca/Oxford vaccine. It's clear that these mechanisms are very similar, how they work. So you would expect them to be similar. Okay, and that's everything I have for the adenovirus vaccine. And if folks have questions, throw them in the chat, and I'm happy to answer them. I'm going to turn it over to Crystal, who's going to be telling us a little bit about One Health.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, let me just share this real quick. All right, you can all see that pretty well. So I'm not going to be talking about vaccines specifically, but I'm going to be talking about kind of all of the things surrounding infectious disease outbreaks. And I don't know if you remember last time we talked about this graphic, which kind of shows all of the things that encompass One Health in order to create healthy environments. So we're going to be talking specifically about this part right here, health systems and surveillance. That's going to be really important for the future and preventing the next pandemic. So we talked about how One Health is an interdisciplinary pan-species approach that is absolutely vital to managing this pandemic and preventing the next one. One of the keys to elevating science and making good decisions for our future is transparency and collaboration. Unfortunately, in recent years, corporate influence on government and political posturing has led to a decrease in transparency and a decrease in worldwide collaboration within the scientific community. As we have cut ties with key groups, which has limited our access to some of the best new research. So back in April of 2020, Newsmax journalist Emerald Robinson said in a press conference, US intelligence is saying this week that the coronavirus likely came from a level 4 lab in Wuhan. There's also another report that the NIH under the Obama administration in 2015 gave that lab $3.7 million in a grant. Why would the US give a grant like that to China? And this reporter was clearly just parroting a conspiracy theory that had zero credibility, but it was kind of an interesting bit of stagecraft. Trump replied, "I've been hearing about that, and we've instructed that if any grants are going to that area, we will end that grant very quickly." Days later, the National Institutes of Health canceled the $3.7 million grant to EcoHealth Alliance. EcoHealth Alliance is a New York-based nonprofit that's focused on research that aims to prevent pandemics and promote conservation in hotspot regions worldwide. And they focus on diseases caused by deforestation, increased interaction between humans and wildlife. The organization has researched the emergence of diseases like severe acute respiratory syndrome, that's SARS, Nipah virus, Middle East respiratory syndrome, Rift Valley fever, and Ebola virus. They also advised the World Organization for Animal Health, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, and the World Health Organization on topics like global wildlife trade and on threats of disease and environmental damage posed by these. And this is the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And EHA had been active in China studying coronaviruses in bats and hoping to stop a SARS pandemic. The alliance had used the grant money to train Chinese scientists at the Wuhan Institute of Virology to catch bats, take fecal and blood samples, and analyze them for viruses. The Wuhan Institute of Virology was also a partner of EHA, that's the EcoHealth Alliance, who had since become the center of a lot of conspiracy theories recently. Those working in government have also embraced some of these conspiracy theories, which led to the NIH feeling pressure to cut ties. The unverified theories have suggested that the virus was synthesized by Wuhan Institute of Virology, and the majority of virologists and infectious disease experts are saying this new virus is most likely to have evolved naturally, but nobody's really listening. So these conspiracy theories also believe that WIV was owned by GlaxoSmithKline, which owned Pfizer. This is not true either. GlaxoSmithKline does not own Pfizer. The Institute is part of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, which is governed by the State Council of the People's Republic of China. This is Peter Daszak. He is a British zoologist, disease ecologist, and the president of EHA. And since then, he's been doxxed and harassed by conspiracy theorists. He is quoted as saying, by instantly folding under pressure from the president, the NIH has reduced our ability to prevent the next pandemic coming out of China, and it has bolstered conspiracy theorists. In May of 77 Nobel laureates signed an open letter to NIH Director Francis Collins and Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar denouncing the grant's cancellation. They said, "We believe this action sets a dangerous precedent by interfering in the conduct of science and jeopardizes public trust in the process of awarding federal funds for research." The NIH technically reinstated the grant, but with such severe restrictions, it's still effectively suspended. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about One Health and all of the issues that lead to the next pandemic. So as humans encroach on biodiverse areas and rainforests and increase contact with other species, this is when virus outbreaks occur. Understanding where these events take place, why they take place, and preventing them is key to discovering and stopping the next pandemic. Of course, there's also a lot of folks with economic interest, and they are hoping to perpetuate practices that will end up causing the next pandemic. A 2015 study found that land use changes like deforestation, urban sprawl, and road building are the leading drivers of pathogen spillover from wildlife to humans. We discussed last time that 3/4 of zoonotic diseases originate in wildlife. Recent approaches to disease surveillance and control have mostly been disease specific and reactive in nature. So we try to tackle pathogens after they have been emerged, they have already emerged. We could try to discover what pathogens exist in wildlife, but that would be a huge undertaking, and pathogens would continue to emerge even after we thought we discovered all of them. So Targeted disease surveillance is needed to optimize prevention and control measures and reduce the threat of future zoonotic emerging infectious diseases. This table kind of shows what affects these, what causes these emergent infectious disease events. In this table, they identified all unique zoonotic pathogens, a total of 183 from a published database of 335 emerging infectious disease events. Most drivers in emerging infectious disease as classified by the Institute of Medicine include human demographics and behavior, technology and industry, economic development and land use, international travel and commerce, microbial adaptation and change, and a breakdown of public health measures. You can see the most common causes of EID events are land use change and agricultural industry change. When they ranked by primary EID driver, land use change, agricultural industry change, and international travel and commerce are globally the top 3 drivers of zoonosis. Catherine Machalaba, a policy advisor and research scientist at EHA, says, when you are changing an ecosystem, when you are deforesting a landscape and converting it to monocultures, when you are bringing in livestock, building roads, building human settlements, all of these factors increase the risk of spillover. And together, they dramatically increase the risk. And we are also seeing an increase in frequency of emerging infectious diseases. And the following graphs I will show you come from this letter in Nature. And this is a breakdown of what kind of infectious diseases we are seeing. There is a spike you'll see in 1980 to 1990. This was found to be due to increased susceptibility to infection due to the HIV/AIDS pandemic, they believe. The largest number of events come from bacteria or rickettsial infections. The second largest is viruses or prions, with a smaller number of protozoa. These are like malaria and toxoplasmosis. Then fungal infections like Cryptococcus, aspergillosis, coccidiomycosis, which is valley fever. And then helminths, which are worms like hookworms, roundworm, and whipworm. This graph shows the ratio of zoonotic from wildlife and zoonotic from non-wildlife and non-zoonotic diseases throughout the decades. The emergence of zoonotic EIDs from non-wildlife hosts is mostly predicted by human population density, human population growth, and latitude, not by wildlife host species richness. These are like your non-wildlife hosts. So it doesn't matter if you're like near rainforest. EID events caused by drug-resistant microbes are affected by human population density and growth, latitude, and rainfall. In this study in particular, they say that the majority, 60.3% of EID events are caused by zoonotic pathogens, which is consistent with previous analysis. 71.8% of these zoonotic EID events were caused by pathogens with a wildlife origin. For example, the emergence of Nipah virus in Malaysia and SARS in China. But I'll go into Nipah virus a little bit more because it's also kind of livestock related. The number of EID events caused by pathogens originating in wildlife has increased significantly with time. And they made up 52% of EID events in the most recent decade. This supports the suggestion that zoonotic EIDs represent an increasing and very significant threat to global health. And this is Nipah virus. And they bring up how basically Nipah virus originates from fruit bats who like to eat mango trees, and they found there's this outbreak in Malaysia related to this. And Nipah was the name of a farming town where it originated. And it's actually the virus that inspired the movie Contagion. They had mango trees next to a pig farm, and bats would come and feed on the mangoes, and the bats would drop mangoes with saliva and other fluids into the pig pens. And then the virus then invaded the domestic pigs. Malaysia ended up having to kill 1 million pigs across the country in order to stop the virus. In humans, it leads to encephalitis or swelling of the brain and has a 75% fatality rate. And it's transmitted by direct contact with infected animals such as bats or pigs. Consuming food products that have been contaminated with bodily fluids of infected animals, and close contact with a person infected. So even though they say this is a wildlife origin thing, it really has to do with our interaction with animals raised by humans. And this chart just shows EID events caused by drug-resistant microbes versus non-drug resistant. Drug-resistant microbes represent 20.9% of EID events in their database. And the number of drug-resistant microbes has significantly increased with time. This is likely related to the rise in antimicrobial drug use, particularly in well-developed countries, which goes back to the fact that 80% of all antibiotics sold in the United States are sold for use in animal agriculture. Recently, the World Health Organization called antimicrobial resistance an increasing serious threat to global public health that requires action across all government sectors and society. And we're seeing a lot of antibiotic resistant in our patients who are infected with COVID-19. They get a lot of secondary infections, and there's no antibiotics available to help them. Antibiotics are administered to animals in feed to marginally improve growth rates and to prevent infections when hundreds and thousands of animals are confined into close quarters in factory farming practices. The WHO expects this to increase dramatically worldwide over the next 15 years. There is growing evidence that antibiotic resistance in humans is promoted by the widespread use of therapeutic antibiotics in animals. Resistant bacteria are transmitted to humans through direct contact with animals, by exposure to animal manure through consumption of undercooked meat, and through contact with uncooked meat or surfaces meat has touched. Oops. Go back right here. And this is just basically a chart of vector-borne illnesses. Vectors are mosquitoes and things like that that transmit infected pathogens between humans or from animals to humans. And many of them are blood-sucking insects, which ingest disease-producing microorganisms during a blood meal from an infected host, a human or another species, and later transmit it to a new host after the pathogen has replicated. Often, once a vector becomes infectious, they are capable of transmitting the pathogen for the rest of their life during each subsequent blood meal. Not surprisingly, they also found that human population density was a common, significant, independent predictor of EID events in all categories. This makes sense that disease emergence is largely a product of anthropogenic and demographic changes, and this is the hidden cost of human economic development. And you can see all of these red dots are related to the EID events. And I just want to talk about spillover events. This graphic kind of shows just a hypothetical of how SARS-CoV-2 could spill over from infected humans to native wildlife hosts in North America. And then there could be a wildlife reservoir of SARS-CoV-2 that we could continually get infected with. I added also a little mink that was not included on this graphic, which is very likely. We last week talked about the mink farms, how mink were getting infected, transmitting it back and forth to humans, and then mink were also escaping from these factory farms and going out into the wilderness where they could potentially create a reservoir. And Nipah virus is also an example of a spillover event that we talked about. That's just when a reservoir population with a high pathogen prevalence comes into contact with a novel host population. The pathogen is transmitted from the reservoir population and then is transmitted within the host population. This quote is from the Berlin Principles on One Health, drafted in October of 2019 at the One Planet, One Health, One Future conference. It says, the international spread of emerging infectious diseases has created a world where regular outbreak and spillover events are the new norms. Unfortunately, One Health has to overcome the inertia of bureaucracies and political and economic interests of the powerful. We saw how EcoHealth Alliance lost funding for its collaborative programs, and now I'm going to show you another example. PREDICT was a federally funded program that sent scientists around the world to search for viruses that might lead to the next pandemic. Before PREDICT, we had no idea how many viruses there were out there. It was a $200 million program that was launched in 2009 under the Obama administration in response to the H5N1 flu outbreak. And it was led by the US Agency for International Development, or USAID, in partnership with EHA. And this was at the University of California, Davis's One Health Institute. In their work, they discovered that there were more than 1.6 million viruses out there. Of that, some 600,000 have the potential to spill into the human population. And they had more than 6,800 people trained for the One Health workforce in over 30 countries to lay the foundation for a global system of viral threat detection. And they also had more than 60 laboratory systems enhanced with biosecure zoonotic disease detection capabilities. Their work resulted in 949 novel viruses detected and 217 known viruses detected. This quote is from the head of PREDICT, Dennis Carroll, who says, viruses don't spread, people spread viruses. We can change the way we behave on Earth. PREDICT was able to broaden the scientific community's understanding of spillover hotspots, biodiverse ecosystems like tropical rainforests, where deforestation, agricultural expansion, settlement growth, and other forces that are driving the emergence of novel infectious diseases. But in October of 2019, Trump's USAID program decided to end PREDICT because of the culture of America First and the desire to cut funding to essential programs like the World Health Organization. An organization like PREDICT that sent money to places like China to look for viruses wasn't going to fly with this administration. So one of the first great global examples of One Health came to an end just prior to the largest pandemic of our generation. Susan Lieberman, vice president of the Wildlife Conservation Society, who is a leader in the One Health movement, is quoted as saying, "The impediments to One Health in the past and moving forward are entrenched economic interests." Peter Zach says we need a complete realignment of our relationship with nature. Rich countries are far removed from the origins of these pandemics, but they are driven by us. The activities that cause emerging diseases are the same activities that give us palm oil in every food product, the metals in our phones, the fur trim on our winter jackets. They are the wildlife trade, the mining industry, industrial meat production, industrial agricultural, fossil fuel production, urban sprawl, all the things that tear up animal habitats, wipe out species, and put humans, livestock, and wildlife in abundant contact. To take One Health to its logical conclusion would mean truly confronting these forces of commercial expansion and exploitation. It would mean ending factory farming and an end to the commercial wildlife trade. USAID is funding a new international program to combat zoonotic disease. The program is called Strategies to Prevent Spillover. It is not the same as PREDICT, but it does aim to develop rapid response interventions in zoonotic hotspots in order to head off outbreaks. And Biden has repeatedly promised to revive PREDICT after he takes office. And so I have one final happy One Health story to share with you all. And this kind of encompasses everything that we're aiming for. And bats have gotten a bad rap because they are actually super important. The Bracken Cave Preserve in Texas is home to 20 million Mexican free-tailed bats. It is the largest population of mammals in the world who are not human. In 2013, a real estate company was going to build a sprawling residential complex of 3,800 homes right in the flight path of the bat cave. The group Bat Conservation International got involved. Myla Bayless, the chief of strategic partnerships, said that by sticking people in the pathway of nature, the proposed development was going to create a human-wildlife conflict where none existed. The humans could harass the bats, cause a fire in the cave, which is filled with their highly flammable guano, bat poop, but also expose the humans to their viruses. And the bats would likely end up nesting in the roofs and drink from the pools. And here, EcoHealth Alliance ended up getting involved. Jonathan Epstein, a EHA scientist, looked at the conservation risks, health risks, and environmental risks. After 3 months of study, he provided a report to the city council. It explained how the bats provided a valuable service. They feast on insects each night, adding up to a more than $3.7 billion worth of pest control each year in the US. When bats are around to eat insects, there are fewer insect pests causing damage to crops, and farmers don't have to invest as much in pesticides. But building in that area would cause an uptick in rabies virus, coronaviruses, and others. It would increase demand on public health resources and animal control resources. Ultimately, the groups raised $20.5 million. They ended up buying the property near the Bracken Cave from the developer. And then Bayless says at the end, this is a truly inspiring story because it went from the crazy bat people jumping up and down screaming, "Save the bats," to it being a really complex, carefully brokered deal that included city government, county government, 2 nonprofits, and the public water utility. And this is the kind of advocacy we need to work in alignment with nature, the world around us, to address these issues. And thank you very much. That's all I have for you. Any questions on that, let me know. I used to grow up in a place where there was tons of bats. And I actually would find them on the ground all the time, and I would pick them up and hold them. I don't recommend doing that. That's really dangerous, but it was really fun. They're really cute. I really like bats. So. And next we're throwing it to Dean, I guess. Or no, Andrew. Andrew's next.
That's right, I'm back.
I grew up in Clayton, by the way. There was tons of bats.
Where's Clayton?
Clayton's on the other side of Mount Diablo. It's kind of southeast of here.
Okay. Folks can see
I
my
did not write that in the chat. Somebody is pretending to be me. I agree.
Okay, so in keeping with our theme of looking towards the future, something on a lot of people's minds is, well, when can I get the vaccine? And I want to give a little update on this. Here in California, we have fully begun phase 1A of the vaccine rollout, and this includes healthcare workers and long-term care patients. These are either folks who are likely exposed to COVID-19 on a regular basis or at our especially high risk of contracting and dying from the disease. We are now starting to move, though, towards phase 1B, as we see a few people on the call who've gotten vaccinated. And this includes folks who are 65 or older, and in some cases 75 or older, or those whose work puts them at a really high risk of COVID-19 exposure. And that's a lot of people. There's at least 6 million people in California alone who are over 65. And that's not even including the high-risk workers. And so that's going to take a lot of time. And in a month or two, depending on how long all the vaccination takes, which is very hard to predict, unfortunately, we are going to start moving into phase 1C. And this is going to include folks who are 50 or older, as well as people of really any age who are at increased risk. And I know there have been some news reports already of people getting the vaccine through sort of just being at the right place at the right time. For example, maybe some of you heard about, there was this man who was just at the grocery store and he was offered a COVID-19 vaccine because some of the healthcare workers who had planned to get vaccinated couldn't make it. And the vaccine was going to go bad anyway because it had already been out of the fridge for so long. And so he ended up getting this vaccine, even though I think he was a healthy 20-something-year-old. Now that's pretty rare, but planning ahead, I think there is some concern that people in this increased risk category are going to be a little tricky to really define, and that maybe some people will be getting the vaccine who shouldn't be getting it. And the CDC has put together a list of conditions that put you at higher risk for COVID-19, and this is based on COVID-19 hospitalizations. And this is the entire list. Now, the list is somewhat controversial. For example, you'll notice at the bottom, there's type 2 diabetes, and you don't see, though, type 1 diabetes. And there are some people who think that type 1 diabetes should be on there as well, especially people who have type 1 diabetes. Now, the thing is, with such a large effort as vaccinating millions of people, it's going to be difficult to enforce some of these guidelines. And there will be people who will try to get the vaccine a little early. I know UCSF, for example, in prioritizing their phase 1A, so prioritizing which frontline healthcare workers will get the vaccine first, they had to go just based on the honor system, because it's really just too difficult to integrate healthcare records with vaccine rollouts at this scale. And most experts have decided that it's going to save more lives to just try to move faster and get people vaccinated sooner. And that's going to mean mostly using the honor system. And I think it will be a relatively small number of people who are going to try to game the system. And I certainly would discourage anyone from trying to game the system. But for the small number of accidents that happen, at least those people will now be vaccinated. And that is our eventual goal, right? So I think there will be some mistakes that are going to happen, but we shouldn't be too worried about it. Okay, so you might be thinking, once I get vaccinated, then I'll be free. I can do anything. Unfortunately, this is not quite the case, and there will be some limitations, and I want to go through why this is likely to be. So vaccines are not perfectly effective. We've already seen that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are 95% effective at stopping COVID-19, but the people in those trials, they were social distancing. They were wearing masks. These trials largely happened in the US between October and December. So the instances where the vaccine really prevented someone from getting COVID-19 probably involved just an exposure to a very small amount of virus and from maybe just a single person. Now, if you get the vaccine and you decide to not social distance, and you're suddenly maybe in a large crowd and nobody's wearing masks, and you're interacting with maybe multiple people with COVID-19, you may be getting exposed to much more of the virus, and the vaccine could be less effective. We just don't know. And so that is one big concern. And even if it were still 95% effective, 5% is still a pretty big chance. 5% of millions of people is still a lot of people. So that's one concern. And the other one is that vaccinated folks could spread COVID-19 to non-vaccinated folks. Now, this is something that we just don't know yet if it's possible. And until we know, you really want to make sure that once you're vaccinated, everyone that you're interacting with where you're not wearing a mask is either in your household or also has been vaccinated. For example, let's say Alex has gotten 2 shots of the vaccine and has waited 2 weeks to allow the immune system to fully kick in. And so Alex is likely immune to COVID-19. Now, if Alex and Brett are hanging out without masks on, indoors, and Brett was actually sick, Alex might be able to pick up some of the virus in their respiratory tract. Now, Alex likely won't get sick, right? 95% chance. But if later in the day, let's say Alex and Cameron are hanging out, Cameron, who is unvaccinated, it's possible that Alex could spread that virus to Cameron, and Cameron could get sick. And so in this way, Alex is really spreading that virus from Brett to Cameron. Now, hopefully we'll know soon if this is actually a concern or not. But it's another reason in the meantime, even if you're vaccinated, to still wear a mask when interacting with folks who have not been vaccinated. Okay, so here's what is safe. If there's a group of people who all have gotten their 2 shots of the vaccine and they've waited 2 weeks for their immune system to fully kick in, most experts agree that it's safe for them to gather indoors, possibly even without masks. Without masks should be okay. And if you do this with a small group of people, it's probably safe. So you could resume things like board game nights or dinners. But even once you're vaccinated, I would say going somewhere like a movie theater, yeah, that's still risky, and experts are not recommending traveling, anything like that. So it's really limited what you can do safely. So that's sort of the short-term outlook. But what about looking a little longer into the future? Predicting the future is notoriously difficult. If I had a crystal ball, I would say I still see a lot of masks in our future. So everyone hold on to your masks, please. Based on what I've read, this is basically my best estimate for where we're going from here. We'll be in this period 1 from now until at least June of this year. And conditions are going to be very similar to what they've been for the past year. We might see periods of limited reopening, especially as this holiday COVID surge ends. There might be more outdoor dining, but until enough people are really vaccinated, in public, pretty much everyone's going to continue social distancing and wearing masks. Now, if we do a really good job with getting these vaccines out, then sometime between June and August of this year, we will have more than half of the country who either have immunity from the vaccine or natural immunity from having had COVID. And we'll be approaching what is called herd immunity, where the virus can no longer transmit effectively in the community, where that R0 starts dipping below 1. And then things will start to change. So we will begin a second period of true reopening. And in areas where herd immunity is high, we can start, for example, to eat at indoor restaurants, travel more freely, have medium-sized social gatherings, take public transport more freely. I would even expect movie theaters to likely open, and there will probably still be social distancing inside the movie theater. And I would expect many workplaces to start to reopen as well. Now, there's probably still not going to be large sports crowds, especially at indoor stadiums. It's just going to be too risky with people screaming and getting really close to each other. And there will also be local outbreaks in places where there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy, especially as we go into the next winter. And probably everyone will still be wearing masks in public well into 2022. And okay, so then we get into April of 2022, and that's more than a year from now, and we'll be finished with that next winter. And by then, a large portion of the world may be vaccinated. And here we really may start to reach a new normal. This would mean we can finally stop wearing masks in public. We could start to see large gatherings like sports games and concerts. I would say international travel will probably go back to normal. It'll be normal for people to travel to different countries, especially countries where a large number of people have been vaccinated. But in the long future, I wouldn't be surprised if we do see more social acceptance of wearing masks for non-COVID reasons. For example, preventing the spread of flu during flu season, which has been pretty commonplace in parts of Asia since SARS outbreaks. And in terms of the future of the virus itself, it seems likely that COVID-19 may become something like measles, where you're vaccinated when you're really young, and there are pretty rare outbreaks in the developed world where most people are vaccinated or have natural immunity. Depending on where things go, it may also become somewhat seasonal, like a flu, but that will depend on whether it can really mutate rapidly enough, and we're starting to figure that out these days. Okay, well, that's all I have about the future. I do think the future is bright. There's a lot of hope on our horizon, but it'll take time to get there, unfortunately. And I'm happy to answer any more questions in the chat, and I'm going to turn it over to Dean.
Fantastic. Andrew, thank you for that. I'm excited for a new normal, and also, yeah, I'm excited to see how things play out. Hopeful for a better future. Okay, so let me pull my slides up while Andrew answers some questions in the chat. Okay, and as promised, I'm here to conclude with how to talk about the COVID vaccines. We have all this wonderful knowledge that Crystal and Andrew have given us. Now, how do we put it to use, right? Not just for ourselves, but for society around us. So let's get started. So today I'm going to talk about two things. I'm going to talk about an overview of some reasons why people might not trust the vaccinations, and go to some smaller and larger reasons why that might be, and also conclude with how actually to talk with others about the coronavirus vaccines. So why don't people trust the vaccines? So to start off, to give us a baseline, this is a graph from Pew that was released very recently in December that shows how people are comfortable with receiving the vaccinations. You can see that there was a dip last year, but it's been coming back up in November. So we now have 60% of Americans who say that they will probably or definitely get the vaccine. So that's pretty hopeful there, with smaller numbers saying that they probably or definitely would not get the vaccine. So 39% say they wouldn't, 60% say they would. So for people who say that they probably or definitely wouldn't get the vaccine, what are the reasons behind this? So there are four top reasons above 50% that say why people wouldn't get the vaccine. The first one is that they are worried about side effects at 59%. 55% say they do not trust the government to make sure that the vaccine is effective. 53% say the vaccine is too new and want to see how others react to the vaccine. And 51% believe that politics has played too much of a role in the process. So what we're doing in this seminar is empowering you with the knowledge to address some of these vaccinations and see what the science is so that you can address some of these concerns. So if you're here, that means you're in a good place. So those are some of the individual reasons that are given, but these different reasons also vary very widely by the groups of individuals who you're talking to. So this shows with different groups divided by different demographics that you could think of that have different degrees of skepticism for the vaccines. At the top, you see that the most skeptical group tends to be Republicans at 42%, followed by adults between 30 and 49, rural residents, and Black adults, with the median here being at 27%. So group identity is a really important part of predicting how people will feel with receiving the vaccination. So I want to focus first. So this shows that there's two important factors that we could zoom into. And here we see politics and race. We're going to see how those play out. So this is a chart that shows Americans' willingness by party to be vaccinated for COVID-19. The red line here is Republicans, the blue line is Democrats, and the center gray line is for independents. Now, go ahead, look in the chat, and I want to ask if people notice anything that's unique or peculiar about this graph. Go ahead, jump in the chat. What do you notice that is interesting that you would like to observe about this graph? What do you see that's interesting here? I'll be looking in the chat. Really curious as to what people say here. Okay, let me pull that up. So we have Raul is saying that Republicans haven't moved much, nor have independents. Yeah, we're seeing a good amount of straight line progress here, or straight line variation. Margot is saying that Republicans had low trust in September. Yeah, in August, that's definitely true. You saw low trust, and consistently they've had lower trust in other groups. And Andrew is saying that something in mid-September happened and everyone was close together. Okay, so that could be about proximity and things are getting colder. That could be it. When it gets colder, people start to feel like they want to gather with other people more. So what I want to highlight here is that there is a convergence that happens here among party lines. So we see that Democrats had a higher level of initial trust. Oh, there we go. Andrew's saying that the lines were closer together. There we go. So I totally misinterpreted what you said. So Democrats had this high level of trust, and it just declined massively in September. And at the same time, Republicans reversed course. They had trust that was declining through August, and then something happened where they actually increased trust significantly and didn't seem to decline. In fact, they slightly upticked to 50% through that time period. So what was happening here that caused this convergence of different beliefs? Go ahead and drop it in the chat. See if anyone has some current modern American history going on. But really quick, see if we have any guesses as to what may have happened in September that might have caused this convergence. If you want to speak in general terms, that's okay too. Raul is saying, was it the Republican convention? That could be it. That was, well, Republican convention was earlier on. Well, the primaries were earlier on. Maybe it was the RNC. Presidential debates, possibly that could be it. So like a good teacher, I'm going to say those are amazing answers. But the one I'm looking for is at this time, you start to see more discussion around Operation Warp Speed and vaccinations in the federal government. The Trump administration is talking about the vaccine efforts and starting to promoting it more. And basically, Donald Trump goes on the media and says, we plan to have a vaccination available by the election. And that was the key thing. People heard the election is now a factor in the speed of developing the vaccine. So that's not something that everyone wants to hear. People don't want to hear that politics are going to affect the process of development. And that's when you see a lot of Democrats saying, hold on, I'm not trusting this as much as I used to. And Kamala Harris said, we need to make sure that we're being careful and make sure that politics is not unnecessarily speeding the vaccine. And at the same time, you see Republican Party affiliators are starting to increase their trust as the Republican Trump administration is now signaling its outward support for a vaccine and saying that they trust it if it comes out early. So that's a lot of what may explain this convergence here. And the point that I want to leave on is that party identity is a huge part of whether people will be comfortable receiving the vaccine. And there are things that party leadership can do in order to increase that level of trust among these different groups. So that's politics. And the next one I want to focus on is race. And a little bit of a disclosure here. This one is going to get a little more heavy. The subject matter is a little more intense, but it's also valuable information important for us to understand. So recall from our previous slides that one of the highest predictors of whether you'd be distrustful of a vaccine is racial identity, particularly if you're an African American. And a lot of that for a lot of people stems back to particular instances like this. This is a photo of a man in Tuskegee who is receiving a treatment for syphilis, I believe in Alabama. And this was a study of hundreds of men who were being treated for syphilis, exclusively Black men. And what the researchers did was they wanted to see what were the long-term effects of syphilis going forward. And it was about a 40-year study, or I think possibly even longer than 40 years. They wanted to basically test it until all the participants had lived out their lives. So this was medical research that was in line with what was happening at the time. But what was really nefarious about this was that even though it was a 40-year study, 15 years into the process, they already started coming out with life-saving syphilis treatments. People were getting common medical knowledge, understood how you could save people's lives and treat people from getting seriously ill from the disease. And they declined to tell the participants of the study. So now you have hundreds, if not over 1,000 Black men who are living with syphilis who could die from this. People went blind, they may have lost limbs or fingers, and a number of them lost their lives. So many of these men could have lived on and survived, but it was the absolute neglect of the medical researchers to decline life-saving medical treatment to people who needed it to survive. And that it was eventually revealed, I believe, in the 1970s when medical examiners and government regulators started asking whether this was ethical, and it came out as a huge public scandal. And people really started questioning, what practices do we have in American history that aren't treating everybody equitably? So that is the infamous Tuskegee study, and that is only one example in a long history of experimentation on Black Americans. This is documented by bioethicist Harriet Washington in her book Medical Apartheid, and there are many examples of Black American testing. Early on in colonial and post-colonial roots, the study of modern gynecology actually emerged from surgical experiments on enslaved women, and these were done without anesthesia. So gynecology came from surgical non-anesthetic experimentation on enslaved women. Also, many nuclear weapons were initially tested basically on Black civilians in the World War II era. When they were developing the nuclear bombs, they tested exposure to radiation on Black Americans and primarily civilians to see what were the effects of radiation, to see if other people would get sick from it. And then in the 1990s, pharmaceutical companies tested drugs for dieting and weight loss, and they gave them to Black children to see if that would reduce their instances of violent crime. That actually didn't correlate well with that, but what it did do was it actually increased instances of heart disease, and this was a drug that is now banned and actually caused sometimes heart failure in adults, and this was exclusively tested on a group of about 300 Black children exclusively. So we have a long history of really abusive racialized medical testing in the United States. And now to bring that even more into the present, very recent studies are showing that even today, Black patients who experience COVID-19 symptoms are 6 times less likely to receive testing or treatment. So there's a good side to this. Well, we know that racial identity is a huge part of trust in public health and vaccinations. That also means that's an opportunity to create some of that trust among communities who need it as well. This is a photo of Sandra Lindsay, who was the first American to receive the Pfizer American coronavirus vaccine, and she was a nurse and a Black nurse herself. So this may have been part of the reason why people like her were highlighted in receiving the vaccination. Similarly, former Vice President Mike Pence received the vaccination, and hopefully this is part of what may have increased trust for vaccinations among Republican Americans. So that's the first section. There are many reasons why people may not want the vaccine. A lot of that can be overcome just with talking with people one-on-one, and a lot of it is also with higher structural reasons, such as race and politics. So how do we talk with people, regardless of the group, about getting the COVID vaccine? And that is our next slide today, how to talk with others about vaccines. It is really important to communicate clearly with facts, but we also know that that doesn't always work. So I want to draw on some psychological research and personally my experience as a community organizer and someone who's actually organized personal canvassing before in my own work. And I'm going to share 3 points that will help you talk with others. So the first part, there's those 3 parts to this. You have to listen, share connection, and put things in perspective. And the first part we want to talk about today is listening. I came across a really good podcast that Crystal shared with me. It was a fantastic podcast, highly recommend it. And it's with Dr. Kimberly Manning. She's a medical practitioner who talks about how we can increase trust among Black Americans with receiving coronavirus vaccines. And I want to share one story that she told on this podcast. So she's written multiple articles, she's been doing advocacy, and then on her Facebook page, she sees that one of her friends, who is a prominent member of the Black community in her circles, they posted on Facebook saying that he will not be getting the vaccine. He doesn't trust how the government approved it. And he said, don't trust it. It was developed too quickly and watch your back. So one thing that you could have done is start typing furiously away, right? Go on the keyboard and say, how could you do this? I am your friend who is a medical practitioner. Crystal, if you want to drop in the chat, that would be awesome. If you can pull it up, that would be cool. People are asking for it. Art Turner is. But what we could do is start bombarding on Facebook, right? How could you do this? I am someone who has worked so hard to build trust in vaccines and understands the research. Why are you doing this? So, but she doesn't take that approach. What she does is she actually calls him directly. She picks up the phone and in her words, she says, okay, hold on. We need to talk, and we need to be careful about our influence in our circles about this pandemic. So let's see if we can talk things out. So she listened to him. She listened to his points about why he may not be trusting the vaccine. And after talking it out, she notes that they actually were able to come to a perspective change. And he did change his mind. And I think later on, he actually posted publicly that he received the vaccine himself. So that is a really inspiring story. And what we're seeing are a few important things. We're seeing that when she saw someone post publicly about the vaccine that was against it, she talked to him directly. What she did was she wanted to listen precisely to the other person's concerns. And when he said, well, here's something that I'm worried about, her first reaction is, tell me more. Why do you think that? What are some things that you might be concerned about in the vaccine? Whenever someone says, well, first you should always get them to articulate what is a concern that they have. And then once they tell it to you, the first thing you should do is tell me more. The first 3 words that come out of your mouth, tell me more. That allows them to keep on thinking, to articulate their thought process, and for you to really build that sense of trust and connection that shows that you're listening to what they care about and the things that are important to them. And when you're doing that, then they tell you, well, I'm concerned about the vaccination process. I'm concerned about getting the vaccine or getting coronavirus myself from it because it's the thing. And you can say, well, I attended the seminar. And what I know is that mRNA is not the vaccine, is not the virus itself. It is a part of it that can tell your cells in your immune system to fight the virus, but it doesn't actually give you the virus itself. So you can explain the science, but the first thing you should do before talking is you should listen to the other person. So why is listening important? Well, to conclude, research suggests that arguing with people actually strengthens their position, even when you feel like you won. So you may have felt like you had this awesome argument. You totally got every single one of the points down. You remembered everything that Crystal and Andrew said in the seminar, and you laid it out in a really articulate and lengthy Facebook post. And then somehow, for some reason, they still aren't persuaded. And that's not just me. It's not just you. That's actually backed up by a lot of research that shows that arguing can strengthen the other person's position. So what you want to do is listen to them one-on-one, hear their personal concerns and validate them, and show how their concerns are actually things that might lead them to want to support the vaccine. Maybe not even for themselves at first, but at least be open to it in the future. That's really hard to do on social media. So be like Kimberly Manning, and instead of talking to people publicly on Facebook, talk to them one-on-one, call them, get to them virtually one-on-one in person, and really listen to what matters to them individually. So that's the first part of listening. And the second part I want to talk about is sharing connection. This is a really, really interesting section. I love this part. And what I want to focus on is a series of studies that were done in the 1970s. So in the 1970s, psychological researchers wanted to understand basically how do people operate in groups. So what they did was they got numbers of groups of young boys, elementary school age, middle school age, and they basically started dividing them into different groups. And the key thing here is that these young boys often came from the same communities, same schools. They were friends with each other. They knew with each other. They hung out with each other. So they all had these common ties. But they started assigning them into different groups on really arbitrary characteristics. Things like, what is your eye color? Do you have brown eyes, green eyes, blue eyes, etc.? Or maybe on some really silly pseudo-scientific things, like guessing the number of dots that are on a paper. So they would get people to guess number of dots and then break them into groups, sometimes falsely, on whether they were actually accurate number of those groups. And what they showed here is that when you take people even from the same community with a lot of connections, when you start dividing them into arbitrary groups, this can oftentimes mean that they start sympathizing less with the other group. After they divided the groups, they would give these young boys piles of money. Basically, here's a few cents, here's some dollars, and say, now that you have this money, you can do whatever you want with it. But you can share it with members of your group, or you could share it also with people in the other group. And so what happened was, when you looked at groups that did not divide among any groups or among any characteristics and said, here's everyone in the same group, they actually shared very, very equally among each other. They wanted to be fair. They wanted to equally share their resources. But when you divided them between the eye color groups or the dot testing groups, they started really, really definitely not giving to their group. And sometimes they would even penalize the other group and try to take money away from them, even if it meant hurting their own group. So let me say that again. They would give less or no money to the other group, even if their group would receive even less money at the end. People were willing to hurt themselves if it meant inflicting even more damage on someone that they saw as another. So that's really profound. And this is something that happened among middle school boys, just from some super stupid, frankly stupid, arbitrary characteristics. Now, if that's what people can be divided on through arbitrary things like how many dots you can guess on a piece of paper, imagine how much group division can be created when you scale to larger things like politics, race, your urbanism, any sort of identity characteristic. So it shows that identity and group affiliation is a huge part of what we believe and the things that we're willing to do from our beliefs. So this might be really scary. We've seen identity conflict in our daily lives and our politics all around us. But the good thing is there are things that we can do to overcome it. It's really hard, but if you've seen the last slide, one thing that you want to do is you want to listen to the other person. That is a huge part of it. And that's what we see here. This is a study from Canvassing in Los Angeles that was done by the Leadership Lab and the LA LGBT Center. And what they were trying to do is canvass and knock one-on-one. And they wanted to see if they could increase support for pro-trans and pro-LGBTQ legislation. So they would talk to these people one-on-one. And it was really inspiring because they often saw sometimes up to double-digit 10, 17% increases in the number of people who are willing to support trans and LGBTQ legislation. And this is several years before, when this wasn't as accepted as it is today, even especially in places like Berkeley. So this one-on-one canvassing experience is now hailed as one of the most important studies in one-on-one political persuasion, and it's all about listening. What they're doing is they're exchanging stories. And more importantly, one key thing that they're doing here is that they're sharing connection in their personal experiences. So these canvassers often didn't even share a particular identity with the other person. You would have whites, trans, gay people who are knocking on the doors of people who are not white, gay, or trans, or other races, right? And still they were able to see these significant increases. So they weren't able to connect on certain identity lines, but what they were able to do was they could say, have you ever felt discriminated yourself? Have you ever felt like you were treated unfairly? And they would get people to open up about their personal stories. When you get people to share something that is part of their identity, you can then connect with that and show, thank you for telling me that. And here's why it's so important that if you felt discriminated before in your personal life, that's why we should make sure that no one has to feel like that ever, and make sure that no one is discriminated against. So when we connect that sense of personal identity to the issue that we're talking about, that's a really valuable way of being able to connect with someone. And that's a way of trying to transcend some of the identity politics that we have seen in our daily lives. So if someone is distrustful of vaccines, if someone has felt like others have not treated fairly or not listened to them about their concerns, when you listen to somebody and you show that you and them are on the same team, that is one way of being able to communicate the actual ideas that you're trying to get across with them. So that is the second part, sharing connection. And the third thing that I want to conclude on is putting these conversations into perspective. So let's return to this chart. This is people who said that they would not get a COVID vaccination. Remember that 60% say they would. Another, let's see here, 39% say they would not. And when you break this down into the people that say they would not, almost half, about 46% say, you know, I could have my mind changed. It's possible that I would get the vaccine. So when you take these numbers together, you have 81% of the population who could get the vaccine, who are open to it, who could have their minds changed. Those are really good numbers right off the bat, from 60% increasing that to 81% towards getting the large numbers that we need for herd immunity. And to put this into context, this is a quote from Dr. Anthony Fauci saying, on herd immunity, we don't really know what the real number is for how much of the vaccination we need in the public for us to be totally okay. But I think the real number, the real range is somewhere between 70 to 90%. So Andrew, Crystal, feel free to jump more in the chat, but between 70 to 90%, probably on the middle to higher end of that, is about what scientists are estimating, what it would take for us to reach herd immunity with the vaccines. So that's important because it shows that you don't need to convince every single person. If you have one friend on Facebook who is a really hardliner about not receiving the vaccine, sometimes about their own personal experiences that might make them feel distrustful, you can kind of put it into perspective, zoom out, take a deep breath and say, okay, well, maybe this person is not having their mind open right now, but maybe they can change their mind in the long term, and maybe there are others who I should be talking to instead. So what I want to note here is that keeping things in perspective will lower the stakes of a particular conversation. It will help take off some pressure and let you keep in mind that the important thing is to maintain that sense of connection with them in the long term. Because remember about listening and identity, it's not just the actual facts and logic that gets people to change their minds. It's when people feel that they're on the same team as the other person. So make sure to try to keep that sense of team and connection with the other person, because maybe they don't change their mind on the spot, but it keeps them open to down the road when they might be able to see more things and talk to more people, and maybe even yourself later on about being able to talk about the vaccine on more open terms. So the more people who we have their minds open or prime them for being open in the future, the better off we'll be. So that's my final slide. Again, listen to others, hear their concerns one-on-one, share a connection with them that makes them feel like you're on the same team, and zoom out to get a sense of perspective and realize that you don't need to convince every single person right away, and try to maintain your relationship with that person so they can change their mind down the line. And that is how you can talk with others about the coronavirus vaccine. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Margot. Appreciate that. I like the claps. Claps for everybody.
Mm.
Cool.
that. So I wanted to open up to Q&A, but just because we have so many people, I want everyone to stay muted. But folks are welcome to post in the chat any questions that you have. And if you have a long thing that you can't type, well, feel free to message us or email us too. It may be too long for this Q&A. I'll put my contact info in the chat. I just wanted to respond to one comment from Lisa, who said she's a scientist who works on drug development and feels a lot of uncertainty about the vaccines. On one hand, the fears are unfounded, but on the other hand, it's hard to know how effective they really will be. But despite that, she did get a vaccination shot. And so I think that's a good point. I think this is still uncharted territory, and we're doing as well as we can. It will take time, though, to know if these vaccines are as good as they appear to be at the moment, the mRNA vaccines. I'll give folks a second to post in the chat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and feel free to ask any questions about how we can talk with others on my presentation as well.
Yeah, I appreciate all the questions that people asked about my section. I tried to reply to all of them. If you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to me. But there were a lot of really good questions.
Cool. Well, feel free to reach out to me as well. And I know Crystal also dropped her email in the chat. If there's no questions, I guess we could just can close now and let people go.
Wait, Raul.
There was one.
Never mind. All right, Raul.
Yeah, I mean, folks are welcome to drop off if they need to. But just a reminder that we won't be meeting next Sunday, but we will be meeting on the 7th. And hopefully by then we'll have a lot of really good updates on hopefully the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. I expect there's going to be some interesting things happening in the next 2 weeks, as there's always new things happening. One thing that I wanted to cover was the new viral strains that are coming out, but as I looked at the research, we just don't know enough about it. It seems the UK strain is not that concerning, but there's a South Africa and Brazil strain that is more concerning, but it's really too soon to say.
Raul says, thanks for the COVID timeline, Andrew. I have heard that depending on states, some healthcare workers, as high as 50%, are refusing the vaccine. Apparently, this area of occupation was expected to be a more willing group of people to take the vaccine. Could this affect the herd immunity timeline a lot? Also, the rollout has been very slow.
Yeah, that's a good point. Healthcare workers are still a relatively small fraction of the population. And so even if they had poor vaccination rates, I think it could still be okay. It is, of course, concerning that these are the folks who should be most educated and most knowledgeable about the vaccines. So I'm not sure what they're seeing, but it'd be interesting to talk to them. And like Dean said, maybe we could try to understand where they're coming from. And I would be more concerned about the rollout. The fact that the rollout is so slow, that is going to impact that timeline. And I sort of said June to August, but it's probably going to be closer to August.
Yeah.
I haven't been following the news very much, but I know Biden has his 100 million vaccines within 100 days of office plan that he has. A lot of people are saying that actually is too slow because right now we are ramping up to vaccinate about 1 million people a day. So it's not that great of a plan. But I personally think among healthcare workers that the more millions of people that they see are getting vaccinated, the more it'll become more comfortable to them. I think everybody was a little hesitant at first, but I think once it starts rolling out, more healthcare workers will adopt it. That's just my own personal sense, though.
Yeah, so I mean, that's where identity really kicks in. And when we see people who are like us, who are our friends and our community members receiving the vaccine, those numbers are going to start to tick up. I actually think that one hopeful thing about the slow rollout, at least on a personal level, is that it shows that we don't need to convince everyone at the same time all at once. In reality, it's going to take time for people to receive the vaccine anyway. So it kind of takes the stress off of saying, I need to convince this person right now. Because in reality, it's going to take months before people, the vast majority of people, are eligible in the first place. So it's important that everyone who can receive the vaccine does, so that we can take care of ourselves and others and our loved ones. But it's nice to put things in that perspective as well, and note that trends are improving and we're going to see things going up.
I saw a comment from George about being around smokers. I'm not sure what you mean by that. So smoking does increase your risk for severe COVID-19. I don't know about secondhand smoke. I'm not sure if that's what you're getting at there.
Yeah, I mostly was concerned with like secondhand smoke. There aren't like many studies on secondhand smoke, or if any. Maybe you can touch on that.
Not that I know of. I could look into it and let you know in the future. Just for your own general health, I would avoid secondhand smoke because it has been linked to cancer. So yeah, I would generally avoid that.
I wonder if children are well, I mean, children are at low risk anyway, but yeah, people who are around secondhand smoke, if they're at increased risk at all, but I don't know if that study's been done, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it has been.
Yeah, but I've not seen anything about it. And then Dean, do you want to comment on Michelle's question?
Sure. What's the question?
Well, it's kind of long. Maybe you could read it.
Okay. She was also saying that none of the vaccines have the virus in them. I had my child vaccinated, but she doesn't. I'm just wondering what to say to someone like this. Okay, yeah. So this concern is that they might actually contract the virus from the vaccination, which is one of the most common concerns that people have about it. First thing I would do is tell me more. How would, tell me more about your concerns. Do you have a loved one who might contract coronavirus if you get it, that you're worried about? What are your concerns with getting the virus? And then after they say, well, I don't want to get my mom sick because I take care of her. And, if I get the vaccine, I give it to her, I would never forgive myself. And you could say, yeah, thank you for telling me that. The good thing is that the mRNA vaccines are actually specifically designed to not contain the active virus. What they're doing is they're giving you something that activates the spike proteins to give your immune system immunity. So it's not giving you the virus, it's strengthening your immune system. And that will actually help protect you and your mother so that you can keep her more safe. And the vaccine is one way of doing that. And that's why I'm going to get the vaccine myself.
Thank you. I just wanted to, I think it was really interesting because she was actually the person who told me this morning that none of them actually have the vaccine in them, even though she still doesn't want to have anything to do with vaccines herself. I think it's a strange thing because she's so smart and so intelligent, but even just measles vaccines and stuff, she doesn't trust those for her children. So it's just interesting. So I'll just try to do what you say, But yeah, actually, my mom got vaccinated yesterday morning with a lot of older people.
Oh, good. Congratulations for her.
Yeah.
And I know the feeling. I actually, when I was preparing for this presentation, I actually had to drop off the call on an emergency without telling Andrew, Crystal, and Raymond. And that's because I actually have family members who themselves are very against vaccinations. And they believe that my brother, who I've lived with for a long time, that my brother received autism from vaccines, and that makes them very distrustful of vaccines in general. I don't believe the vaccines cause autism, but it's something that a lot of people have this visceral fear. How do you tell a parent who believes that their child's life was permanently changed from something that their beliefs on that are wrong? So it's difficult, and it's nice to put it in perspective and say, you sound like someone who really cares about your family's health, and you're very intelligent and want to look at all the facts. So let's see in these coming months as we learn more about the vaccines, whether they're safe, and then let's make a decision as that goes on.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Congrats again to your mom. That's awesome.
I'll reply briefly to Raul's comment. Yeah, well, it depends on the exact type of pathogen, but viruses can survive just fine frozen or refrigerated. It's actually often heat that is destructive for them. So yeah, there are vaccines that are frozen or refrigerated that contain live virus, sort of like attenuated viruses, and even the adenoviruses would be a good example of that. Okay, well, let's wrap up. And okay, right, let's let Raul say one last thing.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Dean, for mentioning the historical injustices. But I think it's important also to highlight that today there are still a lot of inequalities, and for example, the mortality rate for Black women giving birth is 3 times lower. So like they die at a higher rate, a 3 times higher rate than other women. And there was also this story about a doctor, Dr. Susan Moore, who was treating COVID patients who herself got COVID. And she was telling the doctor that she needed this type of medicine, and he refused to give it to her. Yeah. So there's still a lot of work to do, even like right now. Like this is still kind of going on, and that also I think adds to the hesitation and stuff.
Absolutely. I mean, with coronavirus, I mean, with people like Susan Moore, Black Americans are 6 times more likely to not be believed by doctors when they say that they need treatment. They're 6 times more likely to not receive the treatment that they need to actually survive coronavirus. And that's something that's happening right now in this pandemic right here. And you're right. That's something that we need to recognize, to be able to treat everybody with respect and actually address a global health crisis. So thanks, Raul. That's a really important point.
Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. Hope to see you all in 2 weeks.
Bye, everybody. See you later.
Bye. Have a good day.